Hey everybody on YouTube, it's Rachel, the Student Witch, and welcome back to my channel. I don't know when I'm gonna upload this, but I'm recording this on the day of Samhain here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's October 31st, and I don't really know where I'm going with this video. It's just some world events and also some a loss in the community has just gotten my mind going and thinking about the idea of empowerment and witchcraft, and there's just been a confluence of different influences in my personal life, but also just some videos I happened upon that were uploaded by some fellow witchy pagan YouTubers that have kind of sparked some thoughts about what we can do when times are kind of tough. Now, it's kind of a hard time for the community because a prominent member has recently and unexpectedly passed. But also just more and more shitty things keep happening in the world. And I suppose this is kind of a VR to a couple of videos I've seen recently. The RandomWitch, I think today, posted a video just and random, if you're watching this, I was crying along with you just spilling her guts out about like how she wanted so much to celebrate Samhain. It's, you know, for a lot of witches and pagans, this is one of our favorite times of the year, and it's so magical, and it's a time to honor the ancestors and work some powerful magic. But the current political climate in the United States, and I would add political bullshit happening in other parts of the world, has put a damper on the celebration of Samhain, of epic witchiness, right? And I guess I'm also responding to Angie Speaks, and I'll have both their videos linked below, but Angie Speaks today also published a video about witchcraft and witches as, or the archetype of the witch as a tool of political empowerment. So I'm responding to those two videos, and I'll of course have them linked below if you want to check those out. And so let me move the camera a little bit closer. Witchcraft, I've said this several times in several different videos, but witchcraft informs so many aspects of my life, and the archetype of the witch and performing and owning that archetype myself has been so empowering. My academic research is definitely informed by my witchcraft. I'm currently at the beginning stages of putting my doctoral dissertation together, and in that dissertation I plan on tracing the history of apocalypticism and its influence on Spanish colonialism from the colonial period to the present day, and I hope to analyze how contemporary queer, Latinx, Afro-Latinx artists, writers, thinkers, immigrants use apocalypticism and apocalyptic themes in their works to challenge the negative legacy of colonialism. And these negative legacies include white supremacy, homophobia, heteronormativity, everything that Europe dumped into the New World, because I work specifically within a New World context and from a Latin American and Latinx studies perspective, right? All these things that colonial Christianity and the evangelical efforts of the Catholic Church, and now more evangelical and Protestant branches of Christianity, have dumped onto Native American populations and onto African populations that were forced to come over here as forced labor and slaves. And so witchcraft and the religious and spiritual traditions of the oppressed form the basis of my theoretical arguments for my own dissertation, because by studying the apocalypse and apocalypticism in this way, I am subverting the systemic oppression and powers that be, or I'm highlighting how these Latinx and Afro-Latinx people, writers, artists, immigrants, subvert just the coloniality of systemic oppression, right? And so in relation to witchcraft and paganism and the archetype of the witch and the different diasporic traditions of Afro-Caribbean religious traditions and African-American spiritual and magical traditions. I'm thinking of root work, conjure, hoodoo, santeria, candomblé, all these different traditions, and also the traditions of the indigenous populations here have been resources and tools for the oppressed, right? For those who are forced into the margins and the undersides of modernity. Modernity being this label of historical development and civilization that was exclusively reserved for the Europeans, who defined themselves as the pinnacle of civilization and progress and scientific discovery, while they simultaneously labeled everybody else as backwards, uncivilized, savage, right? So the backwards, uncivilized, savage, oppressed peoples had to resort to their magical and spiritual traditions to find and exercise power, the power that was denied to them by the colonizing other, right? And this isn't even limited to people of color, because if you look at how capitalism works, and you study or you look at traditions like the Appalachian folk magic tradition and the magical traditions of even the poor white settlers and poor European immigrants, right? Those who have been left out of neoliberal capitalism, or those who have suffered from neoliberal capitalism, have resorted to these sorts of practices too. So, being that my academic work is so anti-colonial and so critical of European epistemology and just Europe's tendency to universalize its perspective and history while erasing the perspectives of everybody else. I find power in my own magical and spiritual practice. I find that I am tapping into a source of power that unites myself as somebody from a working class, rural Kentucky background with roots in Appalachia, with the greater network of ancestors, of people like me who have been forced to the underside of modernity and who have suffered the negative effects of neoliberal capitalism, who have suffered varying degrees and at different intersections of oppression. I'm united in that network, and I'm able to tap into that network of power, of resistance against such oppression. Whether I'm consulting herbalism for healing myself because I literally can't afford mental health care, or because I've had so many negative experiences with modern medicine here in the United States, or whether I am turning towards ritual and the idea of working with my goddess, my matron, in order to empower and transform myself. I'm tapping into that larger network of magic, of the tool of the oppressed to use to survive and also to counter such oppression, to find empowerment. I define a witch as a person who understands their power and knows how to use it to affect real change in their life. That's a very broad definition, but in general, that's how I define a witch. And I have this prayer written down on a little piece of paper. I'm looking at it right now at my altar across the room over there, that I say practically every fucking day. And at the end of that prayer, I say to myself, I understand my power and accept my responsibilities. Because if there's one thing that I understand as a witch, as a person who has adopted that archetype, is that I have power. And with that power comes the responsibility to use it for my survival, to use it to fight against systemic oppression in whichever way I can, and the responsibility to use it for the good of the community, of my own. And so I kind of want to send this message out into the universe to see whoever might watch this, that think about if you are feeling drugged down and overwhelmed by all this bullshit, by all the attacks on the LGBTQ community, especially this most recent attack against transgender people, the attacks on people of color and immigrants, the attacks against Jewish people that recently happened, all this violence and hatred and ignorance. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. I don't break down into tears on a daily basis anymore, but definitely on a weekly basis because of this shit. Right? And so things can seem pretty hopeless. Because after so many marches and protests, I mean, Brett Kavanaugh is still sitting on the Supreme Court, right? And I mean, beyond a US context, we have in Brazil, just yesterday or the day before, they elected an extreme right-wing, sexist, homophobic, racist asshole to their presidents to be the president of Brazil. And he won 55% of the vote. I mean, this man, Bolsonaro is his name, he once said that the one mistake that the Brazilian military dictatorship did was to just torture the left-wing activists and politicians instead of straight up killing them. Because Brazil, like many Latin American countries, had a right-wing military dictatorship backed by the United States. But that's a different video and a different story for another time. So, I mean, in Latin America, there's a slow but very real resurgence of fascism and fascist thought, which has always kind of been there. I mean, in my husband's country, Chile, they had a right-wing fascist dictator from 1973 to 1990, and thousands of people were disappeared or tortured by this regime. But you're still going to find right-wing people who say that they still supported what happened, or they still were pro-Pinochet, right? So you have this, this now right-wing president, like crazy asshole president in Brazil. And so I'm afraid that might encourage more of that crap to come out in the open and to take over power in Latin America. I'm going to be living in Chile in South America starting next year, so that's going to be interesting to see that from the inside. But I mean, you have Trumpism spreading worldwide, especially in Europe. Lots of right-wing bullshit happening there. It seems like attacks on human rights and human dignity are happening left and right, from all angles. And it can be overwhelming. It is overwhelming. It is. It's traumatic. It's traumatic because now every time you hear the news or you open up your social media to check on what's happening in the world, you're just expecting the worst, and oftentimes what actually happens is worse than what you expected, right? Just blatant disregard for human dignity and human rights. And it's not just the crazy assholes with the gun going in and shooting up a Jewish synagogue. It's also, on top of that, being codified into law and being legitimized by the leader of the nation, right? Like the white nationalism and the sexism and the misogyny and the homophobia and the transphobia and the xenophobia being targeted against the caravan, aka asylum seekers, is being legitimized and propagated by the fucking president of this country. And so even if Trump is only in office for 4 years, unfortunately the impact and the damage that he's done is going to last a long time. We're going to be dealing with this bullshit and the resurgence or the increase in this bullshit for a very long time. So as a witch, as a person who most likely is sensitive, who might be directly affected by this bullshit themselves, as a witch of color, as a witch in the LGBTQ community, as a non-Christian, as a woman or a femme, what do you do? Like, how do you keep yourself from just giving up all hope? How do you keep your shit together? To me, what's worked for me is tapping back into that power of the archetype of the witch. It's remembering that I do have power, and I have the right to exercise it. But I also understand that the effects of my actions and decisions go out beyond me. You know, my actions and decisions can have a real impact in other people's lives. So with great power comes great responsibility, to use that cheesy phrase, but I think most witches or witchy people understand that. And that might be why we are so comfortable exploring that archetype. The bullshit is real. And it's not going away anytime soon. It's overwhelming. For a lot of people, shit's getting dangerous. But looking back at our witchy ancestors and everything they went through, us witches have always been the ones who knew what to do in the face of this kind of shit. In the face of all these forces that are trying to take away your power, we understand that our power can never be taken away because it comes from within us, right? And we have the ability and the know-how and the cunning to exercise it, to use it. That to me is what being a witch is all about. We are the ones in the shadows. We are the ones in neglected communities. We are the ones that people from oppressed groups turned to for empowerment. They turned to us to be able to exercise some authority and sovereignty in their own lives. So basically, in a nutshell, my answer to this hopelessness and being overwhelmed by all the bullshit is just to remember who you are. Remember your power and use it. March, protest, cast hexes and spells and curses if you want to. I'm not judging. Comfort those who are being most affected by this crap. Practice radical self-love and self-care. That is revolutionary. So, my fellow witches, witch on and take care of yourself. And until next time, many blessings.